I'm Dr. Ken Hanson, coordinator of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program, and I'm very pleased to be here today with my friend and associate who also teaches for our program, Rabbi Yisrael Abisror, who is the Yehudi rabbi at UCF Hillel, Hillel being the Jewish student organization here on campus, and we're going to talk today about basic aspects of Jewish life here in the United States. But first, I want to get to what your position is, what you do here at the University of Central Florida, a little bit about your own background and how you relate and interact with UCF students.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Hanson. So my name is Rabbi Yisrael Abisror. I'm the Yehudi rabbi at Hillel, as well as the director of Yehudi Orlando. I'm also an adjunct professor for the Judaic Studies program at the University of Central Florida. So one of the main, I guess you would say, opportunities I get to have on campus is on a daily basis we get to really see where Jewish students are holding in college life. So we spend our days mainly with one-on-one conversations over coffee at Starbucks, going around meeting students there for emotional support, spiritual support, whatever it may be, and all the meanwhile getting to give them a truly Jewish and equally college experience while they're here at the University of Central Florida.
Tell us a little bit about Yehudi, the organization that you represent, also a little about your own background, where you're from, what brings you to Florida, etc.
Amazing. So Yehudi is actually a fantastic organization. We founded Yehudi about 5 years ago. We're turning 5 this coming December, which started off as a Jewish young professionals program, kind of an opportunity for young professionals just starting in the working field, maybe moving to South Florida, looking to get involved in young professional life while also Jewish life at the same time. The organization grew very rapidly, and today we're actually 6 campuses across the state of Florida. We're in FSU, UCF being the best, UF and FIU, as well as 2 young professional programs in Wynwood in South Florida and in Miami Beach in South Florida.
And you're exclusively in Florida.
And we're exclusively in Florida. And the real goal of Yehudi is trying to, at a time of life where students are moving into college and then moving into the working field, it's an opportunity where they can either really find themselves or they can really lose themselves. So we try to be there as a support system for Jewish students and young professionals across the state.
Outstanding. But you're not originally from Florida.
I'm not originally from Florida. Guilty as charged. I don't know if anybody's originally from Florida, but I'm originally from Central Jersey. And I moved to South Florida, Aventura area. My father actually became a rabbi in a very large synagogue in Aventura, which is in Miami. And we moved there when I was young. So basically a Florida boy, but originally from New Jersey.
And what was your experience growing up as a Jewish kid here in the United States, in New Jersey, then in Florida?
So I actually have been very lucky to have grown up in very large Jewish communities. My father's synagogue on an average Saturday in the middle of the winter, the high season for South Florida, could have anywhere from 500-600 congregants to 700 congregants coming through the day. So I grew up in a very loud and vibrant Jewish community, so I always felt that presence. So it was a really enjoyable experience growing up. Obviously, coming to Central Florida, seeing the opposite side of things, a much smaller community, just really getting started and starting to bud is an interesting perspective to see.
And your background in terms of the Jewish world. We know that the Jewish community is divided between 2 large camps, the Ashkenazi group and the Sephardi or Sephardic Jewry. Now you're from the Sephardic side. Maybe you want to explain a little bit about the 2 different branches of Judaism.
Sure. So actually my mother is Ashkenazi. She comes from Polish descent.
And Ashkenazi means those Jews who come basically in their roots from, say, Eastern Europe?
Eastern Europe, European countries, Poland, the Ukraine, Russia. Largely the entirety of Europe for the most part was Ashkenaz, obviously, except for Spain, Portugal, and parts of Italy, depending on the era. And my father, being originally born and raised in French Morocco, so that it would be the Sephardic roots, which comes from the Middle Eastern countries, coming from North Africa, coming from countries to as far as India. So there's really I wouldn't say a divide necessarily, but more of difference in cultures of Judaism.
Right. Sfarad, of course, being the Hebrew word for Spain.
Spain.
But referring to those Jewish communities, not just in Spain, but Portugal, and then fanning out across the Middle East, across the Mediterranean to Morocco, and points east all the way to the land of Israel, Arab countries. It's a very large and historically rich community, the Sephardic Jews.
Yes, and it's actually interesting because a lot of Jews will say that they are of Sephardi or Sephardic descent, and they may not actually come from Spain. So today it's kind of been maybe just a label that's been put on Jews from all parts of North Africa. My family, we actually have a tradition that we come from directly after the destruction of the Second Temple. Our family emigrated to Morocco. So we actually have no Spanish descent.
You can trace your familial roots all the way back to the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, or immediately after that.
Sure, yes. So we actually...
How do you do that? How do you trace?
So that's... So it's not a folktale. My father's family had, and what would be, I would suppose to be something that, today we have Google, we have the internet, we can look things up, we can find out, virtually anybody and
Ancestry.com.
Ancestry.com, a fantastic resource. My father's family had a shtar, a document that showed the lineage dating all the way back to Mordechai from the story of the book of Esther. So their family was able to trace down. Unfortunately, during my father's generation and his siblings, the letter was actually destroyed in a fire. Mm-hmm. So his siblings actually saw the letter, and many of them talk about this lustrous lineage dating all the way back to Mordechai.
So there was a document, now it's an oral legacy.
Now it's an oral legacy. I missed it just by one generation.
Really? Now, in terms of then the United States and coming to the United States, we know that the hub of Jewish life in America for a very long time, from almost the founding of America, was in the New York, New Jersey area, but it was predominantly Ashkenazic. These were Jews from Europe, from all across Europe, as you mentioned, from east to west, different from the Sephardic group, and predominantly Ashkenazic in the New York area, correct?
Correct. So I would say that, well, I think the Ashkenazi, looking back at pre-World War II and the Holocaust, the Ashkenazi communities were larger in number. So for the most part, I think that, and even with the Holocaust, I think that coming to the United States and the amount of anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism and what caused so many Jews to move in such a short period of time, you would see those numbers reflected. But there are actually older Sephardic communities in the United States, also in the Northeast, that actually date back prior to World War II and even before the 1900s. So we do see
very early in the Americas, Sephardim came, some from South America.
Sure.
So in that sense, the Sephardic communities are actually older than the Ashkenazic communities who became the majority.
I'm not sure if they're older, but it's possible. I mean, as far as what we know to be first, I would assume
all the way back to New Amsterdam before there was a New York.
Oh, so, sure.
Now, then in New York and other places, is it well known, how is it known that you are Sephardic as opposed to Ashkenazic? What are the differences? Is this something that is experienced on a daily basis? I'm Ashkenazic, you're Sephardic, that sort of thing. Or is it just basically such a blend that no one ever thinks about it?
So it's interesting because the United States, I would say, is more of an adaptation of European culture as opposed to North African or Middle Eastern culture. So what would be maybe 150 years ago, my mother's grandfather and my father's grandfather, if they would meet, they would look nothing alike in garb or in culture, in language or anything of the like, obviously being able to get along with that common Judaism. But today in the United States, for the most part, I mean, it's very uncommon for people to know when they first meet me that I'm a Sephardic Jew. Just the garb, the way, the look is really more of a European look that everybody's kind of adopted today in the United States.
And that's the American melting pot.
That's the American melting pot.
In terms of liturgy, synagogue practice, what are the differences?
So The difference is, I would say, that would be very much the same as far as the overall judicial law system. So everything is really the same, same Bible, everything is exactly the same. There's no different, same prayer book. The difference is that when it does come to what we call the nusach, the actual wording of the prayer book, there's going to be differences, but obviously both having the same.
So it's not the same prayer book.
Not the same prayer book.
Different liturgical wording in the prayer
wording,
books.
but for the most part the same framework, meaning to say they have the same silent prayer, just the wording, the order. What's actually interesting about Moroccan Jews is because a great rabbi, the Rosh, moved from France to Morocco, he influenced a lot of the Moroccan Jews to adopt these Ashkenazi customs. So my family that comes from the city of Marrakesh, we actually hold a lot of customs that are Sephardic, and some Ashkenazic customs as well. So we have kind of this blend.
Is an Ashkenazi Jew going to be lost in Sephardi services in synagogue?
I would say, I'd like to say no. It depends where you go. It depends. I think today we see there's a larger emphasis on cantorialship in the Sephardic community. It's very common for a synagogue to still employ a cantor today in almost all Sephardic synagogues, whereas in, I think, Ashkenazic synagogues, not as much. So you will see this very strong presence of custom and pronunciation and the way that the prayer service is led. So it might be difficult if it's your first time. I think because the Ashkenazi community is larger in the United States, for the most part, the Sephardic Jews are used to, stopping in if they're away for a weekend to go to an Ashkenazi shul, and then they won't have that issue as much. But I do think that could, if it's your first time, perhaps, but definitely both keep a warm environment.
And in terms of the state of Israel, historically, the nation was really founded by Ashkenazi Jews.
Correct.
Mostly coming in from Russia in those days, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But then there was a demographic shift that took place after the state actually became a state and was founded, especially as many of the Sephardi communities found it intolerable to live in the Arab countries after the state of Israel was created. There was such an oppression of these very old Sephardi communities that they came pouring in to the new state of Israel and then became the majority. And that's where you really found a difference in culture, in garb, in dress, in mannerisms, and even a clash of cultures, which people don't realize about the state of Israel. That over there, it has been historically a real thing, Sephardic, Ashkenazic. And only more recently are the two cultures beginning to assimilate, almost to the degree that they do in the United States.
Right, so I do think that when you're dealing with such a deep-rooted, serious tradition. We're talking about thousands of years of culture, and obviously carrying that same bond of being a part of the Jewish people. But when you take two cultures and they come together, there's always, I would say, difficulties. But I do feel, and having also lived in Israel, that for the most part they're almost unnoticeable, and that the bond has really become very, very strong. And what's actually interesting, what you do see, is that a lot of the older Ashkenazic communities that moved to Israel going back 100, 200 years, and they lived in a land that at that point in time was predominantly Sephardic, right? The Sephardic Jews were the ones that were going back and forth to Israel for the most part. You do see that the cultures already blended as far as garb and pronunciation and certain things going back already some time. So we see that it just takes time, but Israel's a new state, so we're definitely growing.
I also want to focus in on what it's like being an Orthodox Jew, both in the United States as a large culture, but also in the Jewish community. How many Orthodox Jews are there in the American Jewish community, say as a rough percentage?
percentage of
American
Jews,
Jewry,
of American Jewry. I actually I'm not sure of the exact percentage, so I don't want to misquote it. But I do think that
A relatively small percentage.
relatively small percentage, very, very small percentage. And obviously Judaism as a whole being a very relatively small world religion.
And there are different brands of Orthodox Jews in the United States, as in every other country. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews, especially in the New York area. There's Chabad. There are, can we say, regular Orthodox Jews who are known by wearing a kippah and being more observant in terms of Jewish culture and tradition.
So I would say that it's actually interesting. I'm not sure where these, I would refer to them as almost labels, came about. But the way that I would say Torah observant Jews perceive it is, there's no such a thing as ultra-Orthodox or less Orthodox. There is just a one brand of Judaism. The term brand doesn't really do it justice. And then there are people with different customs. For instance, you can have a Sephardic Jew that can practice just as much Judaism as what today in the United States we would call an ultra-Orthodox Jew, just being that the ultra-Orthodox Jew, perhaps based off of their family custom, looks a little bit more outwardly Jewish. Perhaps they have side curls, peyot, they have a longer beard, they wear maybe
black coat
a black
coat,
a
shtreimel
on Shabbat. So we would assume this label of being ultra-Orthodox, when in actuality, they may be just as practicing to a healthy degree, the same for a Sephardic Jew or what we would call an ultra-Orthodox or an Ashkenazi Jew. So really there is no broken down sects of Orthodox Jewry. There is just Torah observant practicing Jewry. And the same for someone who's Chabad or someone who's not Hasidic and Ashkenazi. They don't view themselves as being different in any way, just a difference of family custom, but not one's more religious and one's less religious. Everybody having that equal care and commitment to their Judaism.
Can you explain the difference between Hasidic and non-Hasidic? You're Sephardic, you're Orthodox, but you're not Hasidic.
Not Hasidic.
What's the difference?
So it's actually interesting. I think that the perspective from the outside is often confused. So Hasidic Jewry, and I am from Sephardic descent, but in some aspects I would consider myself to be Hasidic in certain areas, definitely not with customs, but Hasidic Jewry was founded by Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. And what he saw at the time was that Judaism was taking a hit in Europe. We're going back 200, 250
years ago.
This is
Eastern Europe, Poland area, Galicia.
Galicia, Poland, which eventually spreads to countries like Russia, the Ukraine, and at that time, Czechoslovakia, the countries, all of those Eastern European countries. And what we see is that not reinventing the wheel. Again, in Judaism, we don't have this concept of coming out and changing the storyline. So when we view different sects of Judaism, sometimes people feel that maybe it's the same as in maybe other groups or organizations or religions, where now there are different and separate, and they don't share ideology. The ideology is exactly the same. But what the Baal Shem Tov did, what Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov did, is he was able to bring down this kind of power of Judaism, where it was, let's take it to the layman. Let's tell everybody, you can be involved in Judaism. You can grow. Perhaps you're not a scholar.
Even without many, many years of Torah and Talmud study.
Exactly. That everybody in their own right has the opportunity to connect to God and to connect to their community. And he really brought this through deep, mystical, not talking about content that held its weight. We're talking about some of the greatest leaders of the Jewish people and possibly the world. And what he brought down was something tremendous. And to this day, we see the positive effect of Hasidut as a whole around the entire world.
Full of experience and expression and joy.
Exactly.
And dancing.
And not to say, and depth also, the content is very rich. It's not just let's have a good time. It's also let's understand what it even means to have a good time. But not to say that the other parts of Judaism do not have that. I often say that I feel like Sephardic Jews we were always doing that. I feel like parts of Ashkenazi Jews were always doing that. But he brought it down through what we would call a different part of the Torah. He really brought that out to the people.
And so you have some attraction yourself
sure.
to Hasidic experience, let's put it that way.
Sure. So I wouldn't say in tradition I'm very strong to this French, Moroccan Jewish tradition. I try very hard to keep all of my family customs, and some of my siblings may say I do it a little bit too much, but I try to really, with pronunciation of letters and things that maybe are even lost in our community, to keep them the same. But when it comes to that rich culture of experiencing Judaism and the content of the message that's passed over, I find that Hasidut, this Hasidic movement, has a tremendous amount to offer. And today, actually, if you take a real overview of the entirety of Torah observant Judaism, you'll see that it's really interwoven. There is no Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and then Hasidic group. It's all become one, and that the content has kind of been molded together. Of course, each school practicing maybe more of their tradition, but at the same time holding that content dear together.
Now, you mentioned Torah observant Judaism. Surprising how many people haven't a clue what Torah observant Judaism is. What is it like to be Torah observant? What kind of things do you do on a daily basis? What kind of things do you do that other people don't? What kind of things do you refrain from doing that other people do?
Yeah, so, and it's important that I use that, I'm just point of reference. The reason we use that term Torah observant Jews is we don't want people to think that there are different sects of Judaism, and some say to be true that this is okay, and some say to be true that this is not okay. It really is, we all follow this same basis of the Torah and everything that's within it, the Bible, the Old Testament. And then Torah observant Jews are the ones that I would say, stay true to making sure to keep strong the tradition and to keep all of the mitzvot, all the commandments. Halakha, all
which is
of
Jewish law.
Jewish law.
And Jewish law is more than what is written in the Torah itself. There are reams and reams of Jewish law.
Yeah, and if you walk into a Jewish study hall, the difference between a college library and a Jewish study hall is obviously the sound, the just the pure joy and the almost argument back and forth to come to a decision in what the law is. And obviously just the shelves are pouring over with texts for thousands of years.
And isn't it interesting that study should be equated with pure joy?
Pure joy. And if you actually walk, I had
Wouldn't that be great in a university environment?
Some students have that. It depends. If they're taking your class, I definitely hear good feedback. But it's almost that the Torah is not just, it's not a textbook. And so if you read through the Torah, but you don't have the emotional and spiritual commitment, you're not going to arrive at the same outcome. And I don't mean just that you won't be as quote-unquote good of a person. I mean, you actually will not know the information in the same manner if you come with the right intent and if you have the right drive while you're pursuing this idea.
But to study Torah, one should also study the additional texts, Mishnah, Talmud, which is a lifetime.
A lifetime
of study.
Correct. And the goal is not finishing. The goal is that the Jewish people have a concept that we're always supposed to be involved with Torah study, because Torah study is really what refines mankind. And if we're constantly involved and we're learning every day, it doesn't matter if at the end of a lifetime you were able to finish the Talmud or not, as long as you were constantly committed. Obviously, being beneficial to accomplish that great goal of finishing out the entire Talmud.
But the Talmud is not something that you just pick up and start reading. In fact, it should be studied
in group.
Correct. With a group. Because it's the experience, not just of reading what's on the pages, but of digging into it, of arguing it, of debating it, which is interesting in itself. Because so many people in contemporary culture just have the idea, what's the information? What do I need to know? What do I need to learn? Tell me and I'll recite it back. No, the Talmud trains the mind through argumentation. And that's an end in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's actually interesting that you say that, because when you really look at the Talmud and you spend time from a I guess, a Jewish scholarly perspective, the systematic way that it was passed down and written and compiled is in such a format that not only is the information retained, but it almost resides and lives within you. It's really unique to other texts and other things that you may learn in, say, a college setting. But when it's applied and it's done right in a group, specifically learned with a partner one-on-one, and you dig deep and you argue out the concepts and you really build this idea and this foundation, you really start to understand things that you don't only understand, you know to be true, and you live with them.
Let's take an example, because there's a lot of legal content, but in studying the legal content, we train the mind. So, for example, two people come across a piece of cloth lying in the field, and apparently they come across it at the same time. And one of them says, "It's mine," and the other one says, "It's mine." Now, whose is it? It's a problem, it's an issue. And these are the kind of things that Jewish law wrestles with all the time. It's not theology in the sense that so many Western people think of theological debate. It's very practical, it's down to earth. And how do you determine whose cloth it is?
Right. And then what's interesting about the Talmud, and I guess just to briefly introduce, so Judaism, we believe that when God gave over the Bible, the Old Testament, he also gave over the oral tradition. If you would,
so there are two Torahs that were communicated on Mount Sinai.
There is one Torah with two parts to it, I would say.
Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, and the Torah sheba'al peh, the oral.
The oral Torah, correct. And this tradition, it's not the second chapter of, it's not the prequel, it's one single unit. And actually today we have it written down because people began to forget what was there. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince, he saw that if we wouldn't compile the Mishnah and then later on Ravina and Rav Ashi, the Talmud, we would lose this oral Torah from being passed over. But it's not that one can live without the other. Without the oral Torah, it would be impossible to understand the Bible. It wouldn't even read. And so we need both of these units together. But what's often misunderstood about the Talmud is some of the most famous passages that are in the Talmud, and the Talmud's comprised of many different parts, is these legal concepts of, in this case, two people, they see something in the middle of the street that would be what we would call hefker. It belongs to no one. And they go to pick it up at the same time. Who owns the object? They both grab it. Who made a kinyan? Who made ownership of the object?
Exactly.
But also, the Talmud has storyline that brings out important messages. And even within
parables, folklore, it's massive.
It's massive, but even within the regular legal text, we start to learn things like, well, what does it mean to have a relationship with another person? When I find something, does it just become mine? And so there's not only the practical law, which is deep, and Judaism, what's actually unique from many other cultures is we have a full circuit of judicial law. We don't just, we move in, whether it's civil, whether dealing with something as simple as a monetary dispute, to marriage, to how do we deal with kashrut, kosher in Judaism, and certain foods that we eat and we don't eat. So really it spans the breadth of all of life.
Remarkable. So if you have a burden or a goal, something that you want to accomplish, the reason that you're here on this earth, it's to other Jews, obviously. It's also to non-Jews. What would be your message to each community?
As an individual?
And a rabbi.
And a rabbi. That's a deep question.
It's a deep question, isn't it? Important one.
An important one. I think for starters, to not bore you with all the details, but I think everybody needs to know the answer to that question off the top of their head. Because if we don't have, as individuals, a clear-cut mission of what we're here for, it is going to be extremely difficult for us to, putting aside feeling any satisfaction in life, for us to actually achieve what we are here for. So it's important for us to actually have this goal. So I would say what my goal as an individual is, and a part of the greater whole of Judaism and mankind, is that we're here to be an Or LaGoyim. We're here to be a light unto the nations. That is the Jewish foundation of everything that we do. And we're here to tell the world that There's beauty in the world. There's opportunity for us to make peace. There's opportunity for us to do good things. There's charity. There's giving to the sick. There's giving to the needy. And then at the same time to remind the world that all these things are not just good as individual acts, but they're a part of this greater whole. To tell the world that there's such a thing as God, and that there's a misconception about who God is. And maybe over the past few thousand years of, I wouldn't say modern, but recent history, we've maybe gotten a little bit confused on that definition and coming to an understanding. And of course, our mission is specifically also to tell the Jewish people that, hey, you have something incredible here. You're a part of something that's magnificent. And you have an opportunity to really inspire the world. Go out and get it.
Go out and get it. I love those words, or legoyim, a light to the nations. And it really is twofold, because yes, there is a burden of the Jewish people to be an inspiration, to be that light to all the nations. But in order to do that, then the Jewish people have to experience that light to begin with. So it's twofold. And honestly, that's what we're all about at Jewish Studies, at Judaic Studies as well, because we are an interdisciplinary program that involves Jewish students, obviously, but non-Jews as well. And we have a message to bring to both, to everybody, that's diverse, that's inclusive, and hopefully insightful. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. We could go on and on. Maybe we will.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.